By sunset, the ground was no longer visible. It was buried beneath bodies, broken shields, and discarded weapons. 25,000 men had charged into battle that morning. By nightfall, most of them would never stand again. And the Romans? They had not advanced a single step. They stood exactly where they had stood at dawn. This was not a victory achieved through speed, surprise, or overwhelming force. It was something colder, something far more deliberate. Because on that day, 1,500 Roman soldiers destroyed an army more than 16 times their size, not by attacking, but by waiting. If you had been there, watching from the hills, you would have thought the Romans were already defeated. Before the first sword was raised, before the first shout echoed across the valley, the numbers alone told the story. 25,000 warriors gathered across the field. Men hardened by raids, by tribal wars, by generations of violence. They came from different clans, but they shared the same purpose: to crush the Roman line, break it open, and drown it in blood. Across from them stood just 1,500 Romans. No cavalry to save them, no hidden reinforcements, no room to retreat. Only a narrow stretch of ground behind them, and the knowledge that if the line broke, every man would die where he stood. Any other army would have withdrawn. Any other commander would have looked at the numbers and chosen survival over pride. But the Romans did neither. They locked their shields, they adjusted their footing, and they waited. The barbarians saw hesitation. They mistook silence for fear. From their side of the field came laughter, insults, the clatter of weapons striking shields. They had faced Roman armies before, but never one this small, never one that did not retreat. The warriors surged forward in waves, confident that sheer mass would collapse the enemy line. They believed numbers were enough. They were wrong, because what they were facing was not an army preparing to fight. It was an army preparing to endure. The terrain itself sealed the fate of the day. The Romans had positioned themselves with ruthless precision. Their flanks were protected, their rear anchored. The ground in front of them forced the enemy to approach directly. No wide encirclement, no room to maneuver. Every barbarian who wanted to reach Roman steel would have to walk into it head-on. The enemy believed this favored them. After all, how could a thin red line possibly withstand the impact of tens of thousands? But the Romans had chosen this ground for a reason. They were not planning to defeat the enemy quickly. They were planning to exhaust them. At the center of the Roman line stood the man responsible for this decision, a commander who understood something that most generals never learn. He was not the loudest man in the camp, not the most charismatic, not the kind who promised glory or quick victory. He was known for something far more dangerous: patience. His past campaigns had earned him a reputation among both allies and enemies. He did not chase decisive battles. He did not gamble with his men's lives for honor or praise. He studied behavior. He watched how armies moved, how they breathed, how they tired. And he knew exactly what an undisciplined force looked like when it believed it had already won. The barbarian host across the field was powerful, but it was also predictable. They fought with emotion, with momentum, with bursts of violence that burned hot and fast. The Roman commander understood that if he met them with equal fury, his army would be crushed within the hour. So he chose something else. He ordered his men to do the one thing the enemy could not understand: hold. No pursuit, no reckless countercharge, no heroic advance. Just formation, rotation, breath. Every Roman soldier knew his role. They had trained for this moment not with speeches, but with repetition. Endless drills designed to make obedience automatic. The men did not need to be brave, they needed to be controlled. As the enemy began to advance, the Roman line did not shout back. They did not beat their shields. They did not respond to the insults hurled across the field. They simply waited, because the commander knew something the barbarians did not. The first phase of the battle would decide nothing. The second would decide everything. And the longer the enemy fought on Roman terms, the closer they came to destroying themselves. The attack did not begin all at once. At first, it was only noise. A distant roar rolled across the field as thousands of voices merged into one. Weapons struck shields, feet stamped the earth. The sound grew heavier with every step forward. Then the front ranks began to run. The barbarian charge was not a single organized movement. It was a flood. Men surging ahead, driven by adrenaline, rage, and the certainty that nothing could stop them. From a distance, it looked unstoppable. From the Roman line, it looked exactly as expected. The first wave slammed into the shields with brutal force. Wood cracked, iron screamed against iron, bodies collided, and for a moment, the Roman line bent under the impact. But it did not break. The shields absorbed the shock. The formation held. The Romans did not surge forward to meet the enemy. They did not try to push the barbarians back. They let the enemy come to them. Every barbarian swing was wide and heavy. Axes arced through the air. Swords came down with desperate strength. And every Roman response was small, controlled, and efficient. Short thrusts, quick cuts, movements drilled so deeply into muscle memory that there was no hesitation. Behind the front line, the second rank stood ready. When a Roman tired, he stepped back. Another took his place. No panic, no confusion. The barbarians had no such system. They pushed forward, believing that if they could just apply enough pressure, the Roman wall would collapse. Instead, they found themselves trapped against it. Men at the front could not retreat. The mass behind them kept pushing forward. Those behind could not see what was happening, only that the charge had slowed. And slowing was something their bodies were not prepared for. The first minutes passed in a blur of violence. The ground grew slick beneath their feet. The air thickened with dust and breath. The Romans remained silent. They fought without shouting, without rage. Their faces were hidden behind shields and helmets, their movements precise and restrained. To the barbarians, this was unsettling. They expected fear. They expected resistance driven by desperation. What they encountered instead was indifference. Another wave surged forward. Fresh warriors rushed in, eager to take part in what they believed was an inevitable victory. They collided with men who were already exhausted. The press grew tighter. The heat intensified. Each barbarian had to swing harder, shout louder, fight faster. Not because it was effective, but because it was the only way they knew how to fight. And every extra movement cost them energy. The Roman commander watched from behind the line, unmoving. He did not need reports. He did not need messengers. He could see it happening. The enemy's rhythm was already breaking. What began as powerful, coordinated charges turned into uneven surges. Some men attacked while others hesitated. Gaps opened, then closed again in chaos. The Romans exploited none of it. Not yet. They continued to hold. Minutes turned into long stretches of sustained pressure. For the barbarians, this was unfamiliar territory. They were used to battles decided quickly. Either the enemy broke or they did. They were not trained to fight a wall that did not respond. Every attempt to overwhelm the Roman line ended the same way. The shields held. The formation absorbed the impact. The barbarians paid the cost. Bodies began to pile near the front ranks. The living had to step over the dead to keep attacking. The smell of blood and sweat clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. Some warriors began to slow without realizing it. Their swings lost speed. Their breathing grew harsher. They were still strong, still dangerous, but strength without control bleeds away quickly. The Roman line, by contrast, moved like a single organism. When pressure increased on one section, the men adjusted. Shields overlapped more tightly. The rear ranks stepped closer. No orders were shouted. They did not need to be. Every man knew what the others would do. The barbarians did not understand what they were facing. They believed they were fighting soldiers. They were not. They were fighting a system. And systems do not feel pain. They do not panic. They do not tire the way men do. As the sun climbed higher, the battle showed its true shape. This was no longer a test of courage, it was a test of endurance, and only one side had trained for it. As the hours passed, the nature of the battle began to change. At first, the barbarians had attacked in waves, furious, determined, confident that persistence alone would shatter the Roman line. Now, those waves grew uneven. The pauses between charges lengthened. Men leaned on their weapons. Some removed helmets to draw deeper breaths, unaware that doing so made them vulnerable. The Roman line remained intact. This was no accident. Roman discipline was not a concept, it was a weapon. Each soldier carried more than armor and steel. He carried instructions drilled into him through years of repetition. When to step forward, when to step back, when to strike, when to conserve energy. Every movement was designed to reduce effort and maximize effect. A barbarian fought with his entire body. A Roman fought with inches. Small steps instead of lunges, short thrusts instead of wide swings, shield pressure instead of reckless pursuit. The difference seemed minor. Over minutes, it became decisive. The barbarians had come expecting a clash of wills, a contest of strength and bravery. What they found was something far worse. They were being measured. Every failed charge cost them energy they could not recover. Every moment spent pressing against the shields drained their lungs and muscles. The Romans rotated their front line with clinical precision. A tired man stepped back. A fresh man replaced him. The shield wall never weakened. From the barbarian perspective, it was as if the Romans never grew tired at all. This illusion began to break morale. Warriors who had charged confidently in the morning now hesitated. They looked to their leaders for direction. Their leaders had none. Command in a mass of 25,000 men depended on momentum. When that momentum slowed, authority dissolved. The noise of the battlefield changed. Early in the day, it had been dominated by shouts, war cries, and the clash of weapons. Now there were gaps of uneasy silence. Men stood, panting, staring at the Roman line, trying to understand why it would not fall. Some shouted insults, desperate to provoke a reaction. The Romans did not respond. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They simply stood. This refusal to react was more damaging than any counterattack. The barbarians began to argue among themselves. Some demanded another full charge. Others suggested pulling back to regroup. Neither option appealed to men already exhausted. Every decision required energy they no longer had. The Roman commander watched the enemy carefully. He saw the signs he had been waiting for. Not panic, not fear. Fatigue. Fatigue dulled the senses. It slowed reaction time. It turned bravery into recklessness and hesitation into confusion. This was the Romans had prepared for. Still, the order did not come. The commander knew that striking too early would reset the enemy's adrenaline. The barbarians needed to feel the weight of their own exhaustion. Another attack came, weaker than the last. The front ranks pushed forward without conviction. Some men hesitated before striking. Others swung wildly, driven by frustration rather than intent. The Roman line absorbed the impact with ease. Short thrusts slipped past shields. Controlled strikes found exposed flesh. Men fell. Those behind them stumbled. The cohesion of the barbarian force began to unravel. Small gaps formed where men failed to advance. Instead of closing ranks, others tried to push through them, worsening the disorder. The Romans still did not pursue. They held the line and allowed the chaos to grow. The battlefield had become a place of attrition, and attrition favors the side that can wait longer. The sun burned overhead. Sweat soaked clothing and armor. Throats went dry. For the barbarians, every moment spent standing under that pressure felt endless. For the Romans, it was exactly what they had trained for. They had learned to endure monotony, discomfort, and fear without acting on it. They had learned to obey silence. As the enemy's attacks slowed to scattered attempts, the truth became impossible to ignore. The barbarians were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to keep standing. And the Romans knew that once an army reaches that point, the battle is already over. At some point, the battle stopped sounding like a battle. There were no great charges anymore, no unified shouts, no thunder of thousands of feet striking the earth at once. Instead, there was breathing, heavy, ragged, uneven. Men stood where they were, leaning on spears and axes, staring at the Roman line as if it were something unnatural. The Romans did not move. They did not taunt. They did not advance. They denied the enemy the one thing they needed most: release. For the barbarians, standing still was agony. Their bodies screamed for action. Their muscles burned. Their lungs felt raw with every breath. The instinct to charge, to break the tension with violence, rose again and again, and each time it was weaker. Some warriors dropped to one knee, pretending to adjust their equipment. Others stepped back a few paces, then stopped, unsure whether retreat was permitted. No order came. The leaders who had shouted themselves hoarse in the morning now struggled to be heard. Command disintegrated into isolated voices. The Romans understood this moment well. This was not the calm before the storm. This was the storm exhausting itself. Behind the shields, Roman soldiers focused on small things: the pressure of the grip, the position of their feet, the weight of the shield against the shoulder. They avoided looking at the enemy's faces. Emotion was unnecessary. They trusted the system. The silence stretched. Minutes passed. For the barbarians, each one felt longer than the last. They had expected resistance, fear, even desperation. What they encountered instead was something that felt like judgment. The Roman line stood as if time itself had stopped, unmoved by numbers, unmoved by fury. A few warriors tried to charge on their own. They ran forward, shouting, desperate to reignite the battle. They died quickly. Their bodies fell in front of the Roman shields, unmourned and ignored. The rest of the host watched. No surge followed. No one rushed to avenge them. The spell had been broken. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly. Men began to realize how long they had been fighting, how dry their mouths felt, how heavy their arms had become. Some glanced back over their shoulders. The sight behind them offered no comfort. Thousands stood packed together, equally exhausted, equally uncertain. There was no relief waiting behind them, only more bodies. The Roman commander waited. He had waited his entire career for moments like this. Not the clash, not the charge, the pause. Because it was here, in the pause, that discipline proved its worth. The enemy was no longer an army. It was a crowd that could still kill, but could no longer act as one. A murmur spread through the barbarian ranks. Not words, understanding. They had misjudged the battle. They had thrown themselves against something that could not be intimidated, provoked, or rushed, and now they were trapped in front of it. Some men began to withdraw, slowly, carefully, hoping not to be noticed. Others followed. The movement was subtle at first. A step back, then another. The Romans did not respond. They let it happen. Because a retreat under exhaustion is not an escape. It is the beginning of collapse. As the line of barbarians loosened, gaps opened that could not be closed again. The pressure that had once held them together was gone. What remained was fear, fatigue, and the realization that they had spent everything they had, and it had not been enough. The sun continued its slow descent. Shadows lengthened across the field. The Romans remained exactly where they were, and in that stillness, the outcome of the battle was finally decided. The collapse did not begin with a scream. It began with a step. One man turned away from the Roman line and started walking back through the crowd. He did not run, he did not shout. He simply left. Others noticed. A second man followed, then another. At first it looked harmless, a handful of warriors pulling back to rest. But retreats are contagious. The pressure that had held the barbarian host together was already gone. All it took was permission. Suddenly, Men at the front found themselves with space behind them. And space invites movement. The Roman commander saw it instantly. This was not a feint. This was not a regrouping. This was the moment he had waited for. Still, he did not give the order. Not yet. The barbarians began to argue. Some shouted for discipline. Others demanded a full withdrawal. No one was listening. The line dissolved into overlapping streams of exhausted men pushing past one another. Weapons were lowered. Shields hung at awkward angles. The Roman line tightened. For the first time that day, the Romans prepared to move. Not forward, sideways. Small adjustments rippled through the formation. Shields overlapped more closely. Spacing became precise. This was not an advance. It was preparation. Then panic struck. A shout went up from somewhere in the crowd, a single voice sharp with fear. No one knew what had been said. It didn't matter. The sound alone was enough. Men began to run. Those at the rear pressed forward, unaware that the front ranks were collapsing. Bodies collided. Warriors tripped over the fallen. The crowd turned inward on itself. This was no longer a battle. It was a stampede. That was when the Roman commander gave the order. It was quiet, almost gentle. The Roman line stepped forward as one. Not a charge, not a roar, just movement. The effect was devastating. Exhausted barbarians, already unbalanced, were struck by a wall that suddenly had momentum. Roman shields slammed into bodies, short swords flashed. The Romans did not pursue individuals. They advanced as a single mass, pushing, cutting, compressing. Every step forward multiplied the enemy's panic. Men tried to flee, only to find themselves blocked by their own comrades. The density of the crowd became a weapon against them. Those who fell were trampled. Those who turned to fight did so alone. They were cut down quickly. The Roman advance was methodical, relentless. It did not speed up. It did not slow down. The Romans did not shout. They did not celebrate. They worked. The field transformed in minutes. What had once been an overwhelming force was reduced to fragments. Pockets of men trying to escape a situation they no longer understood. The Romans did not allow them to recover. They pressed forward until resistance collapsed entirely. Only then did the commander signal the halt. The Roman line stopped, exactly as it had begun. Behind them lay silence. In front of them lay the remnants of an army that had destroyed itself. When the movement stopped, the battlefield was almost unrecognizable. The noise was gone. No shouting, no clashing steel, only the low sounds of wind moving across the field and the occasional cry of the wounded. The Romans stood in formation exactly as they had at dawn, shields lowered, weapons held, but no longer raised. In front of them lay the cost of the day. Bodies stretched across the ground in dense clusters, especially where the collapse had begun. Weapons lay where they had fallen from tired hands. Shields were trampled, broken, abandoned. The barbarian army no longer existed. What remained were survivors scattered across the field, fleeing in small groups, too exhausted to look back. The Romans did not pursue them far. There was no need. The battle had already delivered its lesson. Messengers moved quietly along the Roman line, taking counts. The numbers told a story that would be repeated for generations. Tens of thousands had entered the field. Only a fraction would ever fight again. The Roman losses were measured in hundreds, not because they were invulnerable, but because they had refused to fight on the enemy's terms. The commander walked the line slowly. He did not congratulate his men with speeches. He did not promise rewards. He simply nodded. They had done exactly what they were trained to do. Hold position. Trust the system. Outlast the chaos. This victory would not be remembered for daring maneuvers or heroic charges. It would be remembered because it exposed a truth that many armies learned too late. Numbers alone do not win battles. Strength alone does not win battles. Emotion does not win battles. Control does. The barbarians had brought fury, courage, and overwhelming force. The Romans had brought patience. They had understood that an enemy who cannot stop attacking will eventually destroy himself. They had understood that exhaustion is more lethal than steel. And above all, they had understood that discipline is not about aggression. It is about restraint. As the sun set and shadows stretched across the field, the Romans began to withdraw in order. No celebration followed them, no songs. This was not triumph. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the Roman way of war worked, not because it was glorious, but because it was sustainable. Long after the bodies were cleared, the lesson remained. Empires are not built by moments of passion. They are built by systems that endure pressure longer than their enemies. On that day, 1,500 Romans held their position until the enemy was completely exhausted. And in doing so, they destroyed an army 16 times their size. If you want more stories like this, stories where discipline outlives chaos and patience defeats fury, subscribe. Because history does not belong to the loudest. It belongs to those who can wait.